doctors and families should be the ones making the decisions, not, banned from certain treatments by the state in a blanket fashion. I mean, I do feel...
And not trans activists, though, because case, we're talking about the authoritarianism of the left. If the trans activists...
And the right.
Well, yes, but in this specific case, I think it's the left. I doubt it's right-wing authoritarians that are shutting down Ken Zucker's clinic.
3, 2, 1. Welcome, Sitch and Adam of the Sitch and Adam Show. As I've already called you 3 times so far in our intro, my favorite centrists. It's good to see you guys.
What's up? How's it going?
Good to be here.
Yeah. So we talked. You guys were on the show. I don't know how long ago it was now, 6 months or something like that. And Krystal wasn't here that episode. She's excited to be here this episode. So it's I was really looking forward to this. I find this conversation exciting. And I feel like it's rare that you can have like good faith disagreement with people who are coming from an honest place. Usually, this topic in particular is so nuclear red hot that it's impossible to find some common ground on this stuff. So we wanted to discuss. Actually, before we get into the topic, I told Krystal I was going to do this before. I know you guys are big Game of Thrones fans. I am like the #1 Game of Thrones fan. So I wanted to ask
belatedly,
you both
yes.
Your favorite, belatedly. I didn't see it when it first came out. I saw it later, which was good because I got to watch it all one day after the next. I got to finish it pretty quickly. Favorite Game of Thrones character? Adam, you first.
Ooh, that's a tough one.
I know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm not the biggest Game of Thrones fan after all.
You watched the whole...
Give us a few faves then.
I watched it. Yeah, Ned Stark
in like a week.
Ned Stark is obviously completely lovable, but I feel like he's like the go-to that everybody loves. So
It's like too obvious.
Yeah, exactly. But Ned Stark is obviously lovable. Sitch and I have talked extensively about Ned Stark and the contradictions of Ned Stark in the terms of like selectorate theory and Dictator's Handbook and stuff. So I'll just go with Ned Stark, obviously.
What do you think?
Sitch, what do you think?
Well, if we're talking about the book, Jaime is clearly my favorite character. But in the show, he kind of sucks. He's very different. On the show, Ned or Tyrion probably, but book Jaime is the best character. Easily.
Krystal, I don't know if I ever asked you this question before. Who's your favorite?
My favorite. I liked Catelyn a lot, and I also liked Tyrion. I like Tyrion a lot.
You're like the one Catelyn fan, by the way.
As well. Really? People don't like Catelyn? I don't know. She's very strong. Like, she's a mom. I don't know. I related to her.
She also gets, like, everybody killed with her decisions.
Does she, though? Because she's the one who... No, but she told Rob not to marry that bitch. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, she tells Rob to be careful.
Went to King's Landing. Ned wasn't going to go to King's Landing.
No.
Oh, well.
Rob screwed that up for himself. She was in there, like, at great personal cost to herself, being like, this is a bad idea, and he's a prideful man, and you're like screwing around with this is not a good idea. So this is all on Rob.
I was under the impression
you're blaming Catelyn for this shit.
Wait a second.
Misogyny. Oh my god.
Thank you.
Didn't see the Barbie movie. Blames Catelyn.
Ned to go to King's Landing. That Catelyn was the one like you have to go, and he was like, "Fuck."
Well, he's
all right,
gonna have to go.
Well, you want to know what's
After he was
interesting?
told about John Aaron. Anyway, we're getting way deep in the weeds. Let me just give you guys my... So, first of all, I'm 100% with Adam. I have 1 and 1A. 1 is Ned. 2 is actually Tywin Lannister. I think the acting job in the show from the character that played Tywin Lannister is fucking unbelievable. Just like the best villain slash... Like, he's like a villain, but he's kind of not, because you see his code. His code is like family oriented, and he sticks by it 100%, but that leads to very dark places, does the Red Wedding, etc. Anyway, we could probably talk about this for 5 hours, but let's go ahead and get to the main topic.
Well, hold on, though. Since we mentioned Barbie, who's your favorite Barbie?
Oh, come on.
Ken, obviously.
Ken, what do you mean?
Yeah, it's like by a mile.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really like any of them, to be honest with you.
Wow.
They all irritated me in different ways. But yeah, Ken was maybe the least irritating.
Well, and I just want you to know,
see the movie,
Krystal, that in the book, it's the roles between Cat and Ned are reversed. Ned wants to go to King's Landing, and Catelyn doesn't want him to go to King's Landing. Yeah. So
we just started.
I don't remember that. I'll take your word for it. But I could have just like gone over my head.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get to the main topic. That was fun. We honestly could have scheduled a whole Game of Thrones thing. That would have been fun too.
Game of Thrones ties into authoritarianism pretty well, actually.
Oh, that's true.
That's why I love it.
Nice
it's rife with political themes. That's phenomenal. So here's the question that we wanted to dig into. Who is more authoritarian, the woke or the anti-woke? And I was going to give you my position. Krystal will give you hers. You guys can lay out yours. But first, I'll just give you my definition of wokeness so you know like what I'm working off of here. I think there's one definition which has like a positive connotation. Then there's another which has a negative connotation. The positive one was like, if you're woke, you're alert to injustice and trying to change it. The negative definition, I would say, is authoritarian in service of perceived social justice ends. And so typically when I use woke, I am typically using it more as a pejorative. I mean, people who are authoritarian in service of what they think are social justice ends. So with that definition, I would claim today, my thesis is this. I think both sides are authoritarian. Many on both sides can be authoritarian, although you can be woke or anti-woke and not be authoritarian. But I'm more concerned about the anti-woke authoritarians because from my perspective, it manifests in legislation much more often, which directly impacts people. Whereas on the other side, I think that wokeness can be very authoritarian, but it usually manifests more through culture, which is bad, but I just don't think the stakes are as high. So I know that Sitch, for example, I know you like to focus more on the culture and not as much on the legislation, which might explain some of the disconnect here. But tell me your thoughts on this. Since I mentioned Sitch, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on who's more authoritarian and why?
Well, first I'll say I like your definition of woke. The one that I use is generally that woke is the idea that liberalism won't solve our social problems and that something further to the left is required culturally. It's funny that what you said about like how the wokeness manifests or the authoritarianness of wokeness manifests in the left culturally and if through institutions. On the right, it's kind of manifesting through the wall. Because I said the same thing myself several times.
Cool.
And I agree with that framing. However, to be a stick in the mud, I have to question what is the point of framing the question as like who's more authoritarian in the first place?
So, I mean, I guess in my mind, the reason I asked the question that way is because of that distinction that I think the anti-woke people are enforcing it through law. So I think by its very nature, I would consider that more authoritarian because to me, the bar towards authoritarian is, are you legally imposing this on people?
Well, and if I can chime in here, I mean, just in terms of my own personal journey with regards to my view on wokeness, I feel like there's been an arc where there has been huge overreach and more authoritarianism on the side of the quote unquote woke that has, you know, led to a backlash that has led to even more authoritarian tactics from the anti-woke. And, you know, people can hold whatever views they want to hold, good, bad, indifferent, like, you know, and it's fine to have a spectrum of views that are out there, whether I agree with them or not. When it becomes a problem that we should care about as a democratic society, in my opinion, is when it goes from a view I'm advocating for something I'm going to use authoritarian tactics to achieve. So I think that's why the focus on, all right, who's leveraging more authoritarianism in service of their ideology at this point, that's why the question to me is relevant.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with what you said completely, Krystal, about how the wokeness of the left is what's created the anti-woke right-wing backlash, especially the legal backlash that we're seeing in all these state legislatures. And I would just be cautious when we're kind of talking about this question because I don't think it should be used like, oh, the right wing is more authoritarian with their anti-wokeness, so like they're the bad guys. That should be what should be focused on, when it should clearly, in my mind, if the left wokeness is what's creating the anti-woke authoritarian backlash in the law, both these things need to stop, essentially.
Sure, but people are responsible for their own actions. Like the fact that someone did something that pisses you off doesn't mean like you're justified in becoming an authoritarian.
Well, no, it doesn't justify it like morally, but when we're talking about like how coalitions of power form, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think this is true for Trump. Not as much, like 100%, but definitely I think Trump was able to run and is definitely running now. And you see with DeSantis, though he's kind of floundering nationally, kind of trying to run on this energy that if the mainstream American, the normie, the undecided voter, if they're out there and they perceive that the left has lost its mind and is crazy, then they're just going to go to the right, and they might not perceive sort of the legal authoritarianism that we're talking about.
So I want to get Adam in here in a second, but I just wanted to respond to what Krystal and Sitch said, because I actually slightly disagree with you when you said the wokeness from the right, or excuse me, the wokeness from the left led to the right-wing backlash. I actually don't totally agree with that. I think that the right has sort of hyper fixated on some extremes on the left, and then they just sort of act like it's the entire left. And so then it leads to the backlash. So it's like they're perceiving it's the whole left going insane and being authoritarian and hyper focusing on social justice stuff. But really, they're just nitpicking like 5% of something and acting like it's 100% of the left. And that's what then leads to. So it could be a backlash, but I think it's mostly sort of like delusional in a sense that it's like as big a problem as they say it is.
Well, we're also talking about cynical political actors who see something that has energy on their side and that they're going to use to build a national profile a la Ron DeSantis. Yeah,
that I totally agree with. Yeah. All right, Adam, jump in. We haven't heard from you yet.
Well, you pitch this problem to me, and I object to a little bit of the framing of woke and anti-woke because, I do perceive woke as like the authoritarian left. I've never really perceived of the right, people on the right who are against wokeness as authoritarians, because you can have people on the right that are against authoritarianism on the left that aren't authoritarians, like they're not taking extreme positions on gay marriage or abortion or anything like that. You know, they're reasonable people on the right that are against what's going on the left. I think part of the conflict that you will probably perceive with the legislation aspect of it is that the legislation affects people's lives more. But I think there's a perception issue here, because I think the authoritarian tactics that are on the left are in everybody's face all day long at work. And they're not necessarily thinking about the abortion laws or the push to make gay marriage illegal again, or these CRT bans. They're thinking about, I have to walk on eggshells at work and completely censor myself because I might offend somebody, or, some grievance archaeologist might come along and dig up something I said on the internet 10 years ago and try to get me fired. So it's a much more tangible thing for people in their daily lives. And I think that's why a lot of times there's this big push against left-wing authoritarianism that is more present, even though you might say that it's not as important socially or legislatively.
So basically, to sum up your argument, and correct me if I'm wrong, the argument is sort of like culture, in your opinion, supersedes legislation because it seemingly affects more people because culture affects everybody, whereas legislation might affect small pockets of people. I'm not sure I agree with that for one point, but the other point of
go ahead. You're saying that it affects more people. It does affect more people, right?
Well, I would say when it legally affects somebody, that has a bigger impact than just socially or culturally affecting people. Because you could, feel bad about somebody going on a cancel culture crusade against you online, and that can suck. And I don't want to downplay that. But I think it's a lot worse when you talk about legislation going after people in a way where you used to be able to take an abortion pill in state X, and now you can't take an abortion pill in state X. But look,
well, that's only going to matter if you need an abortion or are in a situation where you think you might need an abortion.
That's not the only issue where I would say the anti-woke people have become authoritarian. So like I broke this down into a number of different issues. So like book bans is one thing. We could discuss that. I think there's a lot of book banning coming from the anti-woke right. LGBTQ restrictions, we can get into that if you want, where there's a lot of that coming from the right. There's even protest restrictions in a lot of red states where they're cracking down on free protests in the wake of George Floyd, where there were some riots, but they do these bills that are overreaching where it goes after protests too. You brought up restrictions when it comes to abortion. I think that's a fair thing to bring up too. I even think things like the drug war, I think it's an authoritarian thing to lock somebody up for putting something in their body when they're not hurting anybody else. I think that also affects that, that sort of led to mass incarceration, which impacts a lot of people. So look, I take your point in the sense that culturally, almost by definition, it will affect like everybody, right?
Yeah.
And legislatively, maybe it doesn't. I guess my point is, even though it might be smaller numerically, I think it's like quantitatively a bigger impact. You understand what I'm saying?
Well, it's
qualitatively, qualitatively a bigger impact.
I think it's just a tougher sell politically, obviously. And I think that's why the right is gaining ground on these issues legislatively, because they're able to do it, behind, behind the perception of the general public. And I want to say before we move forward, I'm pro-choice. Like I'm not against limiting abortion. I'm pro-gay marriage. So on those issues, I am definitely on your side. But I do think that there are people on the right that are, in favor of those things as well, that are not necessarily against them. I think it's like a far right thing that they want to ban all abortion and reban gay marriage and stuff like that. But I'll let you guys continue.
I think that's true. And I mean, the polling bears that out. But mostly what we're talking about is what's happening at the Republican elite level, where they're in positions of power to, make laws and enforce them and all the rest. And I think what you're saying assumes that there isn't an aspiration, at least on the right, to not only have sort of authoritarian legislation that is, quote unquote, anti-woke, but they also want the culture. I mean, it's not that they want like free and fair exchange of ideas. There is an overt effort to, we want to be the ones to police the language and police the culture and what people are allowed to say and what sort of dissent they're allowed to have. So I'll give you a perfect example. You probably saw this. There's a whole thing going on over at Texas A&M where first you had a university president who was forced to resign because it came out basically, they changed the deal of a New York Times, former New York Times journalist who was going to be brought into the school in this prominent position. They watered it down under political pressure. That happened. Then you have another Texas A&M professor who criticized the lieutenant governor of the state and has now been suspended and is being investigated over that critique. Wow. The perfect example that I really love, which I always thought sort of said it all, is, Mike Lindell, my pillow guy. Not that he's like, speaks for everyone, but I just thought this was sort of emblematic. He was setting up his own social media platform and he's like, it's a free speech platform, but to me that means no taking the Lord's name in vain, no pornography. Like it was free speech, but as I define what is acceptable. Mm-hmm. So I think there's an assumption in what you said that there isn't also the goal, and that goal is being fulfilled now, to also take control of the culture in a very similar sort of authoritarian fashion.
Well, I think the way that I see these power struggles work is that at all times, there's always extremists in every interest group and everyone on the left and the right. They're always constantly trying to pull society in their direction. But something environmentally has to occur that allows that energy to kind of reach into the mainstream and then allow the mainstream to go in that direction. So like there's always going to be, the people, the far right people who do want to bring the theocracy or, whatever it is they want to bring into America. And they're always pulling. And then I look at it like, well, what's allowing that energy to suddenly like sink its hooks into the consciousness of the mainstream American? And I think, in my opinion, the reason that the right is able to do this, I agree that this is done cynically. There's a big problem right now with the right where, economically, the right-wing populist and the right-wing neocons don't agree on a lot of issues. And so that is part of why, like, it's perfect for them. It's actually perfect for them to fixate on wokeness and social issues because that's where there's an agreement. And if we lived in like a hypothetical world where wokeness didn't exist, it didn't come about in like 2014-ish, I don't know what the Republican Party would be doing right now at all. Right. I have no clue. But because that energy does exist, because the wokeness does exist, it seems like that's what's giving the right the ability to do all this. And that's kind of why, when we're talking about like the issue here about who's more authoritarian, and I don't know if you've been listening to, the Young Turks and Anna Kasparian have been kind of bringing this point up a lot recently, which is that it just seems like when the left defends a lot of these woke issues, it just keeps giving the right easy victories it just tees them up essentially for easy victories, one after the other.
Can I say, one thing I'm curious about is whether you think we've reached peak wokeness, because I actually reject the idea that at this point, this is the anti-woke stuff is even working out that well for the right. I mean,
DeSantis was floundering, and that was his whole thing. He just changed his strategy to put woke on as his fourth biggest issue. It used to be number one. Go ahead.
He says it in like every freaking sentence. He clearly has decided like this is the thing. And I think part of the reason that you're saying, which is that, he's trying to stitch together this coalition of people who don't like Trump with people who used to like Trump and people who are moderate and people who are hard right and whatever. And so he's like, wokeness, that's the place where maybe we can meet. It's obviously not even working out with the Republican base. There's also some signs like bunch of these corporations are firing now their chief diversity officer because they figured out that, these trainings actually actively make people more racist in the workplace and are not working out, and that the whole thing is just a damn grift. So you've got that. You also have on the electoral side, it just doesn't seem to have the juice that the Republican Party seemed to think that it was going to. I mean, 2022, there was a lot of money that was spent on like anti-trans, anti-CRT, et cetera. It obviously didn't work out for them. And then, as I was saying with the Ron DeSantis stuff. So do you think that we've kind of reached peak wokeness and we're on the other side of that?
Well, I think we definitely reached, I think the peak wokeness of like, when the things were the wokest has already passed there, because it does seem like not just the Republicans are pushing back. It does seem like a lot of people are just getting tired of dealing with wokeness, which, to me, that's a great thing. So yeah, we could be reaching that point already. So going forward, it might be less and less advantageous for Republicans to use these issues. But with DeSantis, I'm skeptical that him having problems nationally has anything to do with the wokeness. I think it's funny. I said this from like day one. I said, DeSantis has the charisma of wet cardboard. I just don't perceive him like being able to go on a national stage and really get energy, especially when, he's going up against Trump, which, if you love or hate Trump, you have to acknowledge that he's very charismatic. He has a lot of energy, behind him. And I can't see a world in which how DeSantis can stand up to Trump in that arena.
So let me jump in here because there's a bunch of interesting things I want to respond to. So I think there's some level of like default anti-wokeness that every reasonable person sort of has, right? So to give a couple examples of this is they had polled the term Latinx to see if people are like it, don't like it, use it, don't use it, whatever. It was like under 10%. I don't remember the exact number, 9%, 6%, 3%. It was something like that. Nobody's buying the Latinx stuff. So that's like a default, like when people are like, just don't change our language colossally overnight and pretend like it's some like crusade for morality, because it's not. Stop it. There's also, what was the other example I wanted to give? Defund the police. Defund the police polls at like 18% or something like that, because I think the default perspective for most Americans is like, well, of course we need police. So if you say defund the police, regardless of what point you think you might be making, it sounds like I want to abolish the police and have no police. And people just aren't on board with that. So I think there's like a default anti-wokeness. But I think the problem with DeSantis and many on the right who are on this like anti-woke crusade is that they've started overreaching colossally to the point where they are using the legislation that I talked about before, which is actually authoritarian, which mirrors the tactics of many on the woke side. So, what was the example? Ron DeSantis is currently waging a lawsuit against Bud Light over the ad with Dylan Mulvaney.
Yeah.
So you have a trans person in an ad and you want to wage a lawsuit over this? Like, that strikes me as those shrieking social justice warriors online with the blue hair and the septum ring in 2012 who were telling you, don't do this, you can't do that, stop doing this. It's like Ron DeSantis has become that person, but on the right. You understand what I'm saying?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree. I thought like with the whole Don't Say Gay bill, which was the parental rights education, part of that bill I agreed with, which was that if a school is going to transition or socially transition, I should say, a child, that they should definitely have to notify the parents. And that's wild that wouldn't be the case. And the reason they passed that in Florida was because there was a school that was doing this without notifying the parents, and the child attempted to commit suicide. And so, like, I agree. Like, what happens is like this, like they do something that seems reasonable, but then they always take it too far, because then they add the element of like, well, you can't talk about, gayness existing essentially until 9th grade or whatever the frame point is. So that seems to be the case in all politics. It's like, oh, you agree like with some piece of legislation, but then someone always takes it too far. But but just to go back a second for the peak wokeness, even though I think we have sort of gone past peak wokeness, I mean, it's still happening. It's still an issue. Like it was only a few months ago, I think that it was Uber, I believe, fired or suspended their DEI chief, not because they're like, oh, you're too woke. They fired the DEI chief, who I believe was Asian, because she was trying to push back against people being racist against white people at Uber. And this was this year, only a few months ago. So these issues are still cropping up. And I think to Adam's point, what he said earlier is that even if this legislation is, more, quote, authoritarian because it's a law as opposed to someone being fired from their job or the cultural pressure, it's still the left version of it still is like in everyone's face or in a lot of people's face at all times.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that. You know, where I think the normal, like, well-adjusted human American is, you know, in real life, non-online, super online interactions, they tend to grant the people around them some grace, you know, some charity. Like, there's a ability to screw up and apologize and move forward. And the problem I always had with wokeness was that there was no grace, that it's like anything you said, you screwed up, like that's it, you're done, you're in the bad circle, you're out. And as someone who's been a, you know, lifelong, like, liberal, progressive, leftist, whatever, wherever I was on my own political arc, like, that's a polar opposite of the way that I viewed the world. I always felt that people should be granted that charity, that there should be redemption. Even if you committed a heinous crime, I thought, you know, if you've paid your debt to society and you can reform yourself, I always believed in that vision of grace and charity. But now I do see the exact thing happening, you know, on the right that concerned me among my own side. And, like, I feel like the Libs of TikTok account is the perfect example of this, because you're talking about cancellation coming from the quote unquote left, of like getting people fired and digging up their old social media, et cetera. Like, that's what that whole account is dedicated to. Finding someone who's saying something that is weird or can be taken out of context to seem weird, hunting that person down, ruining their life, putting it in front of as many people as you possibly can. And it's not an accident that that account has become like a huge success on the right at this moment. I mean, that is literally the same cancellation tactics that were so decried when they were used by people who were, you know, on the left, now being deployed by large and at this point powerful account on the right.
Isn't the left, though, always separates cancel culture into cancel culture and accountability culture? And I have I look at cancel culture as trying to cancel people over things that are, you know, untrue, basically digging up evidence of racism, sexism, or homophobia that's kind of on the line, borderline, and, you know, you dig into the person personally and you find out, well, this person's not really a racist or a sexist at all. They're just framing this person as a racist or a sexist to cancel them, which I think is completely different than kind of the Libs of TikTok situation, where, you know, they're oftentimes looking at people who are in positions of power, like teachers and administrators, who are saying and doing things that really are clearly this person's belief system, and trying to put some accountability on that person. So I mean, it's odd.
I don't know how you can say that based on like one TikTok, that like, nope, this captures the entirety of this person and their ideology.
Like, if there's a gay pride flag hanging in a classroom, that's a scandal. Like, should that really be a scandal? Well, I don't care. If there's an American flag in a classroom, I'm fine with it. Why, gay pride flag? I'm fine with it. It doesn't seem like a big deal to me.
Look, I'm outing myself here. I'm not a regular watcher of Libs of TikTok, okay? I don't like watch everything that comes across Libs of TikTok. The few that I've seen, though, and they've actually dug into the people, you find out that the person is, you know, actively indoctrinating people inside the classroom. So it's not just a, you know, innocent remark, or, you know, a teacher that used the N-word in class to say that using the N-word was wrong, and then this person is being mischaracterized as a racist.
I guess
this is a person who actively believes in, you know, LGBT acceptance, and they're out there promoting that in their classroom.
So, but okay, LGBT acceptance, I think, is fine to teach in a classroom, because it's like, hey, people are different, accept that people are different. I agree that there might be a line where it's like, this is inappropriate that you crossed over. But my whole point about the anti-woke crusade is that it has now very clearly gone way past the line. So there's this report that comes out every couple of years, this PEN America report on book bans. And the book bans have been really skyrocketing, and I think it's a direct result of this sort of moral panic.
I hate to interrupt. But I object to the framing of this as a book ban when you're talking about a book that is available anywhere outside of the school library. Like, it's just saying that this material is a little bit too racy for a school library. So they're not banning the books by any means.
Well, so here's my point, though. A lot of the stuff are not over any line whatsoever, and I can give you examples where you'd agree with that. I mean, if you want me to give you a couple examples here. This is from The Hill in April. Quote, in an Ohio school district, officials recently intervened to prevent their children from hearing author James Tharp read his book, It's Okay to Be a Unicorn, during a school visit. Illustrated with bright colors and rainbows, the story is an imaginative jaunt about a unicorn pretending to be a horse who has to summon the courage to reveal his true identity. The book, ostensibly about accepting our true identities and not being afraid of standing out, was prohibited after a single parent complained that the book and author had a gay agenda.
Well, I haven't seen the book, obviously, so I can't comment on that. Obviously, different parents are going to have different objections to different things. I mean, that's part of the democratic process. So, Sitch, you want to chime in on this?
Well, I mean, I guess the issue, like with the book ban stuff, is, I'm assuming I'm sure books that we would all agree shouldn't have been removed from a school. But I'm assuming there's also books that we would all agree should be removed from school. Everyone points to, I'm sure you've seen a million times, they always share this, like, some comic book that shows explicit scenes of, children engaging in oral sex or something. That was in one of these books that was in a lot of these schools. And there's some Toni Morrison books that were removed from a lot of school curriculums that featured, father raping his daughter and things of that nature, which, I understand the artistic merit for some of these things, but I also understand a parent that's not necessarily wanting their child to learn about that in school.
I understand what you're saying completely, but I would just counter with, in this report, they lay out the exact numbers as to which books are being banned, what's in it that's leading for them to be banned. 44% of them are banned for violence, 38% are on mental health, and bullying and suicide and substance abuse. 30% is sexual health, 30% is death, 30% is race, 26% LGBTQ stuff. They only say it's a total of 24% is about, like, sex stuff. The other stuff is like violence, mental health, things involving death or teen pregnancy or whatever. So it's really like we're trying to, like, baby these kids who are coming to an age where they're going to have to start learning about not only crazy things in the world, but also, about their own bodies. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I started getting sex education in 6th grade in New York. And even that maybe felt like it was a borderline, like maybe they should have done it a little earlier, too already starting to experience some things.
I mean, these kids are all on the internet. Like, let's be real.
Yeah, of course.
We have kids, right? What's in the school library, which, by the way, they're never even going to look at, is like the least of my concern with my children's upbringing. I think it speaks more, though, to what we're trying to get at, which is there is a moral panic on the right where there is a freak out about quote unquote wokeness, which encompasses a lot of things, including quote unquote transgender ideology, and has led to a lot of hysterical overreaction, which is translated into a lot of hysterical legislation, which is overtly and being struck down in courts as being against the First Amendment. I mean, a number of Ron DeSantis's laws have already been hit in federal court for, violating people's First Amendment rights. If it was Democratic lawmakers, if it was Joe Biden doing the equivalent on the left, oh my God, would there be a freak out over the authoritarian crackdown on, people's ability to say and do what they want?
Well, you're pitching the book bans as the right being authoritarian. And I just, you put these book bans, which, like I said, I don't even really think it's a book ban. It's a book prohibition in a public school, okay, which is more accurate. You put that up against something like trans women in sports, and it's not even on the radar. Like, it's not even close.
But wait, how?
But whose fault is that? I mean, the numbers are kind of staggering. There's 1,477 instances of books being banned in just 2022 and 2023. That's a 28% increase from the prior 6 months. And it includes, like, Holocaust books, man. There's a book, 2022, Mouse. It's a story of his father's experience in a concentration camp. They banned that.
Look, Kyle, you can get this out on a show, on a progressive talk show.
I do. Yes, I do.
And talk about it. But I'm just saying the general public, the normie voter out there, is not thinking about this stuff. They're thinking about other issues, like,
I agree,
that are much more prevalent in their lives than this issue.
They're also not thinking about trans women in sports.
Trans people are not on their radar.
Affects, like,
they're like, what's a trans person?
I mean, seriously though,
if they have kids in school that are competing against trans women, I guarantee you they're thinking.
Yeah, but
that's
again,
true, but there's 7 of them in the whole country. Go ahead.
I mean, they've literally passed laws in some states where there's like one kid that this law is about. And so I actually, listen, if you poll the public, there's no doubt the public is at this point on the side of trans women shouldn't be competing in girls' sports. Public is on your side on that. But is it the issue that they're voting on? Is it the thing that they're like worried about?
Well,
Is it trying to pay their bills and go about their lives? No,
Look, I don't
not even close.
I completely agree with you. Okay. They're not voting on this issue. The question though is the perception of which side is more authoritarian to the normie voter, right? Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about these books, a few books that are not allowed in the public library, I don't think the normie voter perceives that as a giant infringement on their rights by authoritarians.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people don't even know about these book bans. I think you're right about that. But I think that to bring up a point from earlier, they do know about Roe v. Wade being overturned, and we had like the test case of that in the midterms.
Yes.
And the Republicans really underperformed because that was viewed as an authoritarian move from a conservative Supreme Court.
Sitch and I both said that the abortion issue actually made the Democrats competitive because
and election denying, and the election denying. I think.
All of the January 6th stuff, obviously. Because people do not want to give up their rights to abortion, and it's totally thrown all of that in flux. The question that I have is why do you have President Biden afraid to just come out and say, I am against abortion in the third trimester. I am against late-term abortions.
That's what Roe v. Wade was, though. Roe v. Wade.
I know. Why doesn't he? Why does he support it openly?
Well, I mean, that's the traditional Democratic position. And Biden was actually supported the Hyde Amendment, and the Hyde Amendment mandates that federal tax money can't go towards any abortion. So he's actually even more conservative than your average Democrat on this. But the default Democratic perspective is first trimester, it's a right. Second trimester, there can be some health regulations. Third trimester, states can ban it if they so choose. So I think the traditional Democratic position is like the moderate position. And it's a position I happen to agree with. I don't want abortion at the 9th month, 2 days before the baby's going to be born. And I think, like you said, your average voter doesn't want that either.
I agree.
But I do think to the extent that there is, and I think you're right to identify some discomfort among Democratic politicians. And first of all, I mean, they just don't want to talk about that. And right now, because of the state of affairs in terms of the abortion landscape and Roe versus Wade being overturned, like that is not the live issue that's on the table. But I think you're correctly identifying that, the people who are most invested in these issues and are organized around it are the ones that have the most fringe and extreme positions. And that's certainly the case on the right, people who are pushing nationwide abortion bans and from the moment of conception and heartbeat bills and all of this stuff. And, the activists on the left, the pro-choice activists on the left who do have what I consider to be extreme positions about, yes, no restrictions all the way up to the moment of birth. Those voices are disproportionately powerful in both political parties. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Well, we can talk about abortion because it's definitely a very important issue. I wouldn't really classify abortion as having like a woke issue. I mean, it's obviously an issue the Republicans have been and Democrats have been fighting over for 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
And to me, it's just kind of like they're just using. Well, actually, it didn't really even have anything to do with the woke issue. It's just the Supreme Court, obviously, that Trump got the
I think that's
justices
fair.
he wanted. But just on the abortion thing, I think the problem is kind of like what Adam was laying out. There was a hearing on abortion where the Democrats had invited some experts to speak about abortion, and none of the experts that they invited would be willing to come out against third trimester abortion bans, which is a huge optical mistake for the Democrats because this was all the Republicans were playing. They were just playing clips of these, people testifying to Congress that were terrified of advocating for a third trimester abortion ban. And then I think there's something like 9 states currently that have abortions with no restrictions at all. And so the problem is when we talk to right wingers, because we're both, pro-choice, but within limitations, when we talk to right wingers, all they do is they keep saying, the Democrats want abortions with no restrictions. And I'm like, I don't think that's the average position because I don't think it is. But then they just point to these, 9 states that are doing this. And that's kind of the weird question is, and I think Joe Biden should come. I know he has in the past. I don't know if he's going to do it, this election. But I definitely think that Joe Biden needs to kind of lead on this issue, or some Democrat needs to lead on this issue and say, "Listen,
well, I think
we're in favor of pro-choice, but it has to be, within reason."
Hillary actually debated this with Bernie, and it was one of very few areas where I agreed more with Hillary than Bernie. So I do think Democrats, even in the modern era, this is a position that they're repping. But I'd also point out that there are even more red states where they want to ban it from literally the moment of conception. So I think that to the extent that there's some extremism on this issue, I definitely think it's on both sides. I think it's more on the Republican side, but I don't think, to your point about the book bans too, I don't even think your average American knows about this portion of it. I mean, I have the poll numbers in front of me right here. The most popular position in the country is abortion should be legal under certain circumstances. This is a Gallup poll. That's the most popular position in the country by far. And then you have 13% of the country say it should be illegal in all circumstances. And you have 34% who say it should be legal under any circumstances. So like the country, I think, is squarely in that reasonable range on this issue. But also, I would disagree with everybody here in the sense that I do think abortion and I do think some of these other issues that we wouldn't normally put in the wokeness bucket, I do think they actually belong in there. I agree that they're not colloquially viewed as in there, and I'm like the only person saying this, but I think that anything in the realm of social issues, whether it's cultural stuff or legal stuff relating to social issues, I think all that belongs in the wokeness conversation. That means book bans, that means LGBTQ things, that means, you know, whatever, fill in the blank, abortion, that means anything that could impact people's social lives. I think we should talk about it in the context of abortion, because any sort of authoritarian restrictions on those things, I think is an overreach.
Well, and I do think, I mean, abortion, in my opinion, was probably the most central issue in terms of the midterm election. It sounds like you guys agree with that as well. But I think it ties into a whole basket of issues where it just felt like Republicans were way too out there for normal voters. And, you know, one of those areas where I think Republicans have now really overreached in terms of the center of gravity in conversation and legislation is on, you know, gay and trans issues. You know, there was the initial conversation. You can even see this in the evolution of Ron DeSantis and how he talks about this
and Matt
stuff,
Walsh,
right?
all these guys.
The initial conversation was like worried about sports, which public is, you know, on the side of being worried about sports. Now, you could argue how important that issue is, et cetera, but definitely majority position. Worried about, you know, kids and transitioning. Complex issue. Very complicated. American people feel wary about this. There was like sort of solid ground there. And the framing of this for DeSantis was around parental choice, as we were discussing before. But now it's gone way beyond that, where it's, by the way, for some, increasingly vocal and also as embodied in some legislation, you know, even adults, we're not sure we really want to let them transition, or we want to throw as many roadblocks as we can in their way. And that's where you lose the American public, because American people are like, listen, you're an adult, go do what you want to do, be you, live your life, make your choices. Who am I to say, who am I to judge how you want to live your life? And then there's also been this, you know, it sort of felt like the whole gay marriage situation was settled after Obergefell. Republicans just kind of like, were like, all right, I guess we lost this one. We're moving forward. That increasingly seems to be back on the table, as there's much more conversation about, no, actually, we don't accept gay marriage, and we're, you know, opposed to people being gay, and we think it's degeneracy, okay, groomer, et cetera, et cetera. So on those issues, it feels like there has been a real creep in terms of the rhetoric and the actual positioning. And I said, DeSantis is a perfect example. So when he first starts talking about the quote unquote, don't say gay bill, it's all around parental choice. Well, now that he's running for president in a Republican primary where he's decided he wants to court the hard right, his campaign team is spinning up these videos touting how anti-trans he is and how he's the most anti-trans candidate in the race, which is obviously very different than how he was selling all of this before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm completely against all of that stuff. Like I said, I support gay marriage. I was against the ban of gay marriage in California. I think it was Prop 8 when it happened. Like, it totally disgusted me that California would do something like that. But I have to go back to what Sitch said about how, you know, the cultural landscape really is both extremes on the left and the right are looking for an opportunity to pull their side further in their direction. And on the gay marriage thing, I'm completely against it, and I agree with what you're saying about how, you know, the Matt Walshes of the world have suddenly put gay marriage back on the table. But I do think the left, the Democrats, especially with their kind of blinders on to the potential downsides of some of these affirmative care treatments for children, have opened up an opportunity for the Matt Walshes of the world to do that. And if we lived in a world where there wasn't this affirmative care model that is, I don't think the scientific understanding of what's going on here is enough to come out with the kind of declarations people on the left are coming out with of affirmative care, then I don't think the Matt Walshes of the world would be able to do what they're doing with gay marriage. I think the left opened up that opportunity for them.
So, all right. So let me respond to that. So, like Krystal said, early on in this debate, it was framed around like, hey, man, look, we're just trying to protect kids.
Right.
We don't think you should be genitally mutilating children or whatever. This was the line that they were going with. But over time, that was like mission creep, and eventually got to the point where people like Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles had effectively admitted, even for adults, I don't even really think this should be allowed. I interviewed Jordan Peterson and asked him straight up, like, do you think, trans healthcare should be banned even for adults? And he was like, I don't know. He gave me an I don't know answer, which I thought was crazy. I thought that's a slam dunk, easy. Like, of course it should be allowed for adults. But even when it comes on the legal front, like I have a New York Times article here, many states are trying to restrict gender treatments for adults too. And then they go on to explain that in at least 5 states, actually the number's higher now, I think it's 8 or 9, Republican legislators are proposing bills that would restrict gender affirming care. Some states up to anyone under 21, other states, anybody under 26, they want to do it. So I think there's real mission creep, and they're really overreaching. And when I looked up how the trans healthcare situation already works in this country, I was actually very surprised to see how nuanced it is. Now, I know in Europe it's different and they're more aggressive and there's plenty of things to pick apart and critique there. I've always been sympathetic to people who say, look, when you're dealing with a minor, this is a totally different question. I mean, adults could do what they want. Minors, it's a much more complex question. I totally agree with that. But the way it works right now is, first of all, you need a psychological evaluation to determine whether a child has gender dysphoria. Okay. Right off the bat, by the way, I totally agree with that. I don't think it should just be you walk in, hey, like, I kind of feel it. Okay, let's go. No, I think there should be a psychological evaluation. That's point number one. Then they do puberty blockers, which are not used until after there are signs of early puberty. So that could be anywhere from age 8 to 13 for girls and a year or two later for boys. They have to be used. They've been used for decades to treat what's called precocious puberty, which is basically a medical condition that causes puberty to begin very early. The effects of that are reversible, other than bone density might be an issue. They may cause a decrease in bone density, but then that reverses when the drugs are stopped. And then according to the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, they say hormones start at 16 or older, surgery is 18 and older, and breast removal surgery could be 17 or older. So when I looked at the way the guidelines actually worked right now in the country, I was like, wow, this is actually very like nuanced and reasonable. And so I thought any attempt from legislators to sort of mess with this, I think is overly political, and they're sort of doing the mass hysteria thing as if there's like thousands and thousands of children at 8 years old who are being, castrated or whatever. I just don't think that's accurate. And I think that the way it works now is actually pretty solid. Would you disagree with that?
Yeah, I would disagree with it. Well, when you're talking about the book bans and everything earlier, I think a lot of what is fueling this, and even the overreach and the things I would agree with, is the fear that a lot of parents have for their child, quote, becoming trans or whatever. I think that is kind of what's driving a lot of this. And I do have a lot of questions and concerns with sort of the way in which, the American model is focusing on things. Like you have in Europe, you have, I think it's Finland, Sweden, UK, and Norway, and maybe France. I think they've all stopped using the affirmative care model, which is kind of what you were laying out. And the
Wait, what I just laid out is affirmative care? That's affirmative care, what I described?
Yeah, well, that's a part of the affirmative care model, yes. The other
this
part
seemed more nuanced. I thought affirmative care is you walk in and they're like, all right, we're good to go.
Well, so the affirmative care model is essentially that you're not really challenging someone's identity at all. You're just sort of like saying, let's see, like, we'll let you kind of dictate the terms of kind of what your identity is, essentially. And it goes down the model pathway that you're talking about, where you give someone puberty blockers and then you give them cross-sex hormones and all these other things. And there's a couple problems with that model. The biggest one to me, which hasn't really been addressed I don't think it's ever been addressed to the science, is that before they started giving kids puberty blockers, in the 2000s and earlier, when they looked at children that were going to clinicians and were diagnosed with gender dysphoria, there was something like a massive realm of 60 to 90% of kids would desist once they went through puberty. So that means that 60 to 90% of kids, before they gave kids puberty blockers would be identified as having gender dysphoria. And then when they went through puberty, those feelings of gender dysphoria would go away. But then once they start giving kids puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, that number drops to like somewhere in the realm of like 10 to 20%. And so to me, that's very troubling because you're like, well, wait a minute. We don't want to have a situation where giving the kids puberty blockers, having them socially transition is preventing a natural desistance for children who have gender dysphoria or believe they have gender dysphoria. And this question hasn't really been answered in American medicine. And not only that, but even in I think in Canada it was, there's a doctor named Kenneth Zucker who, I mean, this is a doctor who literally worked, I think he was the head of the APA's work group for actually writing the guidelines for gender dysphoria for children in the DSM-5. And he had a clinic where he was doing non-affirmative care model treatment, which was basically what everyone used to do. And it got shut down essentially by trans activists who were saying that he was doing conversion therapy. And he got fired from doing that. And he actually even was able to sue the school that fired him for defamation and won because he wasn't doing, quote, conversion therapy.
So let me get Krystal in here. I just wanted to point out the first thing that I came across when I tried to figure out, hey, how is this done in the U.S. right now? The very first thing, and I could send you the PBS article if you want that goes into detail about all this stuff, is they say you need a psychological evaluation to determine whether the child has gender dysphoria. Yeah. Which sounds to me like they'll say, hey, if you don't have it, no, we're not going to give you the treatment, which is something I agree with. So I don't know if what you're saying is I don't support the affirmative care model and this isn't the affirmative care model, but whatever you want to call what I just described, that's the thing that I think makes sense. And that's the thing that I would agree with. Go ahead, Chris.
But to me, this all misses what to me is the bigger question is who should be deciding these things. Because I don't think anyone here will disagree that the science is, science is oftentimes complicated, contradictory, nuanced, varies case by case, depending on the person. And so do you want doctors and families to be making these decisions? Or do you want like Sarah Huckabee Sanders to be making these decisions based on the politics of the moment and what she thinks that, her Republican base is going to want to see?
Or trans activists. Because obviously you had Ken Zucker, who is a clinician in a treatment facility who should be making the decisions. I think we would all agree. A scientist who is literally shut down by trans activists.
I agree with that. And he was able to go to, I don't know anything about this case, by the way, but you said he was able to go to court and win. So it seems like,
he's able to win defamation. He's still
not being able to do scientific research is what we need.
Yeah, well, so I don't know anything about this case either, but as you're describing it, I agree that it's sort of egregious. It sounds like we're all coming to, ironically, the enlightened centrist position here, where we're saying, hey, do a real analysis, determine if there's actually gender dysphoria, and then proceed from there.
Yeah, doctors and families should be the ones making the decisions, not, banned from certain treatments by the state in a blanket fashion. I mean, I do feel...
And not trans activists, though, because case, we're talking about the authoritarianism of the left. If the trans activists...
And the right.
Well, yes, but in this specific case, I think it's the left. I doubt it's right-wing authoritarians that are shutting down Ken Zucker's clinic.
Right, but you're talking about one clinic? We're talking about bans that happen across an entire state.
5 states that are banning, transitioning even for adults. That's what I'm talking about. And actually, I think it's more than that now.
I want to address the affirmative care thing because that's really important.
Go ahead.
So I agree that obviously a person should have to go to a psychiatrist or something of that nature to get, diagnosed with gender dysphoria. The problem is if the only acceptable way in America for clinicians or for psychiatrists to diagnose children is through the affirmative care model, which I believe is fundamentally flawed from the beginning, then it doesn't matter if they're getting the therapist saying that they have gender dysphoria because they're following a flawed model that is experimental,
the solution to that
hasn't been tested.
Yeah. I agree with you. I'm just skeptical that it works like that in all cases already. That's the only point I'm making.
Is it like legislation that's the solution? What do you see as being the solution to that? How do you
letting the psychiatrists do their job, it sounds like to me, right? Is that your point, Sitch? Just like let the psychologists do their job without any pressure from either trans activists or Republican legislature? Is that the idea?
Like theoretically, obviously, yeah, like the best case scenario would be, and this has never been done, which is wild to me. Like when we had COVID, which was a virus, you could see a virus under a microscope. It was very clear. Like we knew that it existed, unless you believed conspiracies about 5G towers or whatever. You could see the virus under the microscope, and even with that, when they were testing the vaccine, they have, two groups of people. They give one group the vaccine. They don't give one group anything, or they give them a placebo, right? That's how you test like all these treatments. That's how you test medicine. We've never done this with the affirmative care model, despite the fact that these wild, differences in desistance exist. They've never done this with the affirmative care model, despite the fact that the number of kids, identifying as having gender dysphoria has exploded. And to me, that seems so irresponsible that we're just basically doing this treatment that's never been tested in some kind of, placebo group, control group study. And we're just accepting that this is supposed to be the case. So I agree with you, like theoretically, I would hope that the medicine and that the doctors could do this on their own. But the problem is if they're not doing it on their own, what do we do? Do we just kind of sit there and try to pressure them socially? Or do you need the government to kind of say, whoa, we need to do something about this?
So
what law would you put on the books? Only 16 and up can, get this treatment. Only 18 and up. Like, what law would you propose?
I mean, unfortunately, because I think that gender dysphoria is real, and I do think people are essentially born with it, and I do think kids can have it, but I think that the false positives are going to end up outweighing the true hits. And so I do think that they should probably have at least a 16, but probably an 18-year-old ban on giving kids puberty blockers and anything like that.
Yeah, I think our core disagreement is that I don't agree that the false positives are going to outweigh the real positives. So that's the core of our disagreement. But I see what you're saying. Go ahead, Adam.
Because the detransition rate is so low.
Yeah, that's true too. Go ahead,
Adam.
Yeah,
but the thing is with the detransition rate, like when they talk about the detransition rate, they're talking about people who, like from the long-term studies, who most of them transitioned as adults, or they transitioned before the affirmative care model was in place. We don't really have long-term studies for people that are going through this current
so in other words, we'll see.
Method.
We'll see. I mean, look, my thoughts have always been, if you're somebody who's just like latching onto this as an identity and it's just like a phase you're going through, that's not the kind of person who's going to end up chopping off their dick and balls.
But like,
right? Like that's the way I generally look at it.
You say that, but
I do, yes, very strongly. I say that.
I know,
very strongly.
There's a lot of the ideas around social contagion have been very well studied, and we've seen that there's been a massive amount of social contagion in something like suicide, which is more extreme than, removing parts of your body. Or we've also seen this has been repeated with in the 90s and in the 80s. There was a panic around people getting false memories, where they go to psychiatrists and they go through hypnosis or whatever, or just by talking to psychiatrists, and they'd like, oh, I remember all these memories of being sexually abused as a child by my parents. Or there was another thing where there's a panic where all these people thought that they were part of some sort of satanic ritual, and they could swear that they had been in a cage in kindergarten and that they had, witnessed people do all these satanic rituals. So, and then even before that, there was this whole panic where like the numbers of people identifying as having multiple personalities exploded because a couple movies came out that were like really focusing on multiple personalities. So, and then it's also just, we know with like the placebo effect. So just the idea, like, yes, there's going to be a lot of people that can definitely go down this pathway, especially, and here's something
but I think they'll socially transition. Again, this is our core disagreement. I think that they might like dress as the opposite sex or whatever. But once you get to the point where you're taking like pharmaceutical drugs and you're considering chopping off your fucking private parts, like that's another level that I think people are going to be like, hey, you know what? Let me test this out a little bit before I go further.
This gets back to, like, I think there are reasonable debates and disagreements to have about, and people who are doing this care, even, within amongst themselves, they're having debates about what is the right care protocol and how do we do this that's, best for the young people that we are dealing with here. To me, the question comes back to who are the people who should be making those decisions. And, the core discussion we're having here is about which side is more authoritarian. And I just can't put some trans activists shutting down one clinic on anywhere near the same level as entire states for political reasons telling doctors what they can and can't do.
So
go ahead, Sitch.
Well, okay, so another thing that's kind of troubling is that before the affirmative care model came out and before kind of like the trans craze, if you want to call it that, like recently has sort of started, the number ratio between girls and boys having gender dysphoria, it was like 4-to-1 boys. So there's 4 times as many boys as girls identifying as trans and having gender dysphoria. And now the number is 1-to-1. And there's been no explanation for that increase in girls, except that it's been well documented and well known in science and psychology that girls are far more affected by social contagion and social pressures. And so we kind of get into this realm, and also for girls, and you're talking about like, why would someone cut off parts of their genitalia or whatever? It's actually not that confusing, especially for girls who are kind of exploding the numbers. When you're a young girl, you start going through puberty, you feel weird, right? You have all these chemicals in your brain. You're like, oh, I feel depressed. I feel weird. I feel anxious. I never had these feelings before. Maybe men are staring at me. Maybe men are looking at me sexually. This makes me feel uncomfortable. You take puberty blockers. Oh, maybe those feelings go away. You start taking testosterone, which is a natural mood booster. Oh, you suddenly feel great. It's very easy to see how someone could accidentally go down this pathway. I don't think it's as much of a stretch or as confusing as you would think it would be.
I understand all your arguments, like I fully take them in. I think that's just a core disagreement that we have. I think mostly all the noise around this is kind of a moral panic more than a social contagion. And I think that what's happening with those numbers, as you just described, my perspective on it, and I know you disagree with this, is that I just think people are feeling more comfortable to finally come out of the closet and they are actually trans, in a similar trend that we saw back when we stopped being so repressive towards gay people. So
why is it not an equal proportion? Why is it that girls have this massive increase but boys don't?
Well, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. But, again, I just think the core of our disagreement is I think this is mostly a moral panic. And I agree with you that there's going to be some people who jump onto a fad. Again, I just don't think they're going to be the ones to jump to surgery. Adam, I know you've been trying to jump in.
Well, no, I want to make it clear here. I think the detransition rates that Krystal cites are from like the 60s, when only adults were transitioning and a much smaller number of people were transitioning, right? So a lot of people trot out those numbers thinking that it makes a difference today when we have a bunch of children transitioning, who obviously we know children go through all kinds of fads growing up. So it's a completely different situation. I don't think that that's good evidence.
But it is evidence.
And I guess we'll find
the evidence we have. But hold on. In a review of 27 studies involving almost 8,000 teens and adults who had transgender surgeries in Europe, the US, and Canada, 1% on average expressed any regret. For some, that regret was temporary, but a small number did go on to have. You could say like we need a better.
I would
AP
imagine
News.
I would imagine the vast, like we've dug into those studies.
That's fine.
Yeah, no, that's what we're saying.
But you can't invent the results in your head of what you think is going to happen, and that's going to be better than what actually exists. But it all comes back again to this core point.
This is a radical treatment, making it without really any confirmatory evidence for the current situation that we're in is basically flying in the dark.
Look, if you're right, we will see that there will come a point where the detransition rate overtakes the number of people who continue with the treatment.
But again,
we'll be able to find out in 10, 20 years who's right. I think that's basically the best thing we can come to right now.
I think it's fine
I agree.
to say, I think it's fine to say we have some questions and we're concerned. If we, our kids, we wouldn't do it. Whatever. That's fine. That's for you to decide. But again, it's for you to decide and families to decide and doctors to decide and do your own research and come up with your own theories of the case, versus the state to enforce on doctors what they're allowed to do, even in some instances when it comes to adults.
Yeah.
And that's to me where the authoritarianism, it's fine to read these studies and have questions about, well, why have these ratios changed? And I don't know that I buy these detransition rates. And I think this program care isn't the right one, et cetera. That's all fine. But I don't want the state to tell me, no, this is what we've decided, and this is the only protocol that you're allowed to follow.
And I will say, in your defense, Sitch, in particular, because you're the one who made this policy point, I do think that if we were to poll it, my instinct is most Americans might fall with the 16 and up. You can make that decision. And I just want to say, I think that's way better than the Matt Walshes of the world, who have basically said you should criminalize all this treatment for everybody.
Sure,
so
right.
Yeah.
Matt Walsh, he's obviously coming at this from his religious perspective. Obviously I don't agree with the religious perspective. I learned about gender dysphoria many years ago, before it was a big thing, when I was taking my psych classes. And so I thought it was kind of weird when all this stuff kind of became a political issue, and seeing it kind of become the culture war issue was very bizarre to me. And I'm just focused on making sure that people get the best treatment. And you have situations, I was just listening the other day, there's a very interesting interview with a researcher named Michael Bailey, who was researching some of these topics and about gender dysphoria, and because he wasn't, because he was actually questioning affirmative care and doing some of these other things, essentially trans activists were pressuring the journal that his article was published in to retract the article and things of that nature. And it's just, I agree that, like, theoretically, I would like for this to not be solved through legislation. I mean, I think it's generally, you don't want the government to be legislating, medical practices and things of that nature. You'd hope that the doctors and the researchers and scientists could come to the best conclusion. However, even though the regret rates are very low, and you look at the desistance rates, went from being super high desistance rates to now super low desistance rates, which is incredibly troubling and never been tested. If that's not being tested, I don't know what you do, because you get into the situation where, like, I hate to use a crude example, but you get in the situation of, in the past, when they were handing out lobotomies like candy and they were lobotomizing people left and right. I mean, we might have hoped back then that the government had done something to say, okay, you can't do this without actually, showing effective evidence. So I don't know, like, when you talk about, like, you prefer it not to be legislation, I agree. But if it turns out, as you said, Kyle, like 10 years from now, trans regret rate explodes. I mean,
I don't think
look
that'll
back
happen,
at this
to
and
be
say,
clear.
why did we allow this to happen?
Right. I don't think that'll happen. I'm saying that's what
If
you're
it does,
saying will happen,
right.
and we'll find out if it does. Right. And
Sure.
basically, look, at the end of the day, I think that'll more or less settle the debate, right? Like, among
Yes.
reasonable people, they go, okay, well, yeah, so
A lot of
either didn't happen
casualties.
or it did happen, but, then you'll be able to adjust from there moving forward. Anyway,
Sure.
we've been going for a really long time. We really appreciate you guys joining us. I think it was a fun debate. I love diving into all this stuff. So tell everybody where they can find you.
Sitch, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, well, we're at the Sitch and Adam Show on YouTube. You can check it out. So we stream every Sunday and Tuesdays at 4 p.m. Eastern.
Nice. And they had a great review of the Barbie movie that I highly recommend.
Oh, yeah.
I'm surrounded by Barbie
The
haters. I
important
haven't seen
issues
it.
here.
I'm the enlightened centrist on the issue of Barbie. Okay, I'm agnostic on it, but I have some Barbie haters
Did you
around
guys
me.
see Oppenheimer too?
Not
No,
yet.
not
no.
yet. Not yet.
Yeah.
That one, I thought that one was well done. It is a little too long. Like, there was some stuff they definitely could have trimmed up. I
A
feel like it's always
Christopher
an
Nolan
ego
movie
trip.
that's too wrong. That's
I
too
know,
long.
like-
I can't imagine such a thing.
I always feel like it's an ego trip. They're like, you will sit through our 3 hours of everything we want to put on the
totally.
screen. But it is very good and very thought provoking. So I recommend.
Indeed.
All right.
Everybody check out my favorite enlightened centrists, Sitch and Adam. Thanks for joining us.
This
Nice
was
to
a
meet
lot
you
of
guys.
fun.
Thanks,
Thanks for
guys.
having us on. Yeah.
Our
Enjoyed
pleasure.
it too.
Our pleasure.
Hi, you just listened to a clip from the Sitch and Adams show. If you like what you heard, you can listen to our live show right here on this channel on Sunday, starting at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And if you want, you can super chat us. We read $20 and up super chats on the show and then do a follow-up stream on the following Tuesday where we read the rest of the unread super chats and interact with fans of the show. Subscribe to this channel right here to listen to the live show or to listen to more of our awesome clips.